1,000 feet below the surface of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, in tunnels so narrow you couldn't turn around, men drilled copper out of solid rock using nothing but a hand drill and a 4-pound hammer. No machines, no electricity, no ventilation, just a candle stuck to the wall with clay and the sound of steel hitting rock. They worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures that reached 130 degrees. The water that seeped through the rock was so hot it blistered skin on contact. This is what copper mining looked like before machines. And the copper they pulled out, by hand, built the electrical grid that powered America. But to understand why men would crawl into holes in the earth and swing hammers until their arms went numb, you have to understand what was happening above ground. You have to understand why copper became the most important metal in the country almost overnight. In 1844, the United States had a communication problem. The nation was expanding faster than information could travel. A message sent from New York to Chicago took weeks by horse and stagecoach. News of a presidential election might not reach California for a month. Commerce, governance, and military coordination all suffered because America was simply too big and too slow. Then Samuel Morse sent his first telegraph message. "What hath God wrought?" Those 4 words changed everything. Suddenly, information could travel at the speed of electricity. A message from Washington could reach Boston in minutes instead of days. But there was a catch. The telegraph required miles upon miles of copper wire. Copper conducted electricity better than almost any other metal. It didn't corrode like iron. It could be drawn into thin wires without breaking. And America needed enormous quantities of it. The first telegraph line stretched 40 miles from Washington to Baltimore. By 1850, there were 12,000 miles of telegraph wire crisscrossing the eastern states. By 1861, the transcontinental telegraph reached California. Each mile of line required copper. Hundreds of pounds of it. And that was just the beginning. Because after the telegraph came electric lighting. And after lighting came electric motors. And after motors came every powered device you can imagine. Each one required copper. The nation's hunger for the red metal seemed limitless. The problem was where to find it. Most copper in the world exists as ore. It's mixed with other minerals and has to be smelted, a complex process requiring furnaces and chemicals and expertise. European copper mining had developed over centuries. The knowledge existed, but the ore still needed to be found, dug up, crushed, and processed through multiple stages before yielding usable metal. But in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, specifically in a narrow strip of land called the Quincy Peninsula, something geological happened millions of years ago that exists almost nowhere else on Earth. 1 billion years ago, this region was a volcanic rift zone. Magma pushed up through cracks in the Earth's crust, spreading across the landscape in massive lava flows. As these flows cooled, copper-rich fluids migrated through the rock, depositing pure metallic copper in veins and pockets and irregular masses throughout the basalt. Not copper ore that needed processing, pure metallic copper. Native copper, geologists call it. You could chip it out of the rock and use it immediately. Some pieces weighed tons. The largest single mass of native copper ever found, discovered in the Ontonagon River in 1843, weighed over 3,000 pounds. It took years and multiple attempts to move it. The Ojibwe people had known about this copper for centuries. They mined it using stone tools and fire, heating the rock and then throwing cold water on it to crack it open. They fashioned the copper into tools, weapons, and ornaments. They traded it across a network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Archaeological evidence suggests this indigenous copper trade existed for over 7,000 years. French explorers and Jesuit missionaries documented the copper deposits in the 1600s. They heard stories from the Ojibwe about massive copper boulders lying in rivers. They sent samples back to France. But the Keweenaw was remote, accessible only by water through the Great Lakes, hundreds of miles from any settlement. Extracting copper on an industrial scale seemed impossible. That changed in 1843 when a state geologist named Douglas Houghton published a report confirming the massive copper deposits in the Keweenaw. Houghton had spent years surveying the Upper Peninsula, documenting its mineral wealth with scientific precision. His report landed like a bomb. Within months, prospectors flooded into the wilderness. Ships arriving at the few harbors on the Lake Superior shore were packed with men carrying picks and shovels and dreams of easy wealth. The first copper rush in American history had begun. Houghton himself died in 1845, drowned when his boat capsized on Lake Superior during an October storm. He was 36 years old. The rush he had triggered would continue for another century. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because finding copper was one thing. Getting it out of the ground was another thing entirely. The easy copper, the stuff lying on the surface or in shallow deposits, was gone within a few years. The prospectors who arrived in 1844 and 1845 grabbed what they could carry and shipped it east. Some of them got rich. The Cliff Mine, opened in 1845, struck a massive copper vein almost immediately and paid dividends of over $2 million in its first decade. But most prospectors gave up when they realized the remaining copper was buried deep in the earth, locked inside billions of tons of solid rock. The surface had been skimmed. What remained required going down. To get that copper, you needed infrastructure, you needed capital. You needed men willing to do the most dangerous and physically demanding work imaginable. And you needed time, lots of time. The companies that would dominate Michigan copper mining for the next 80 years weren't run by prospectors. They were run by Boston investors with deep pockets and long timelines. Names like Quincy Mining Company and Calumet and Hecla would become synonymous with American copper production. At their peak, these operations pulled more copper out of the ground than any other mines in the world. The Boston money men never set foot in the mines themselves. They invested from comfortable offices 3,000 miles away. They read reports about production figures and profit margins. They authorized purchases of equipment and approved wage scales. But the actual work of extracting copper fell to a different class of men entirely. And every pound of that copper came at a cost measured in human labor and human lives. If you've made it this far, you're clearly interested in the real history of how America was built. Hit subscribe. I cover the dangerous jobs and forgotten workers that made this country possible, and I think you'll want to see what's coming next. Now, let me take you underground. And I mean, really take you there, because understanding what these men did requires understanding exactly what they experienced. The first thing you need to understand about copper mining in the Keweenaw is that the copper didn't sit in horizontal layers like coal. It existed in vertical veins that plunged deep into the earth at steep angles. Some veins angled down at 45 degrees. Others dropped nearly straight down. This meant miners couldn't simply dig horizontal tunnels and follow the copper. They had to descend. Year after year, decade after decade, the mines went deeper. By the 1880s, some shafts reached over a mile below the surface. The Quincy mine, nicknamed Old Reliable, eventually dropped more than 9,000 feet. But in the 1850s and 1860s, when hand drilling was still the primary method, reaching even 1,000 feet was a monumental achievement, and every foot of that descent had to be carved out of solid rock by men with hand tools. Here's how it worked. A miner would climb down into the shaft using wooden ladders attached to the rock walls. In the early days, before cages and hoists, this climb could take over an hour each way. Imagine descending 1,000 feet of ladder in complete darkness, carrying your tools, your lunch pail, and enough candles to last a 12-hour shift. When you reached your working level, you crawled into a drift, a horizontal tunnel following the copper vein. These drifts were barely large enough for a man to work in. The ceiling might be 4 feet high, the walls pressed in on either side. Your only light came from candles stuck to the rock with clay, their flames flickering in the thin air. The temperature down there was not cold, and despite what you might expect, the deeper you went, the hotter it got. Heat from the Earth's core radiates upward. At 1,000 feet, rock temperatures reach 90 degrees. At 2,000 feet, over 100. But the real problem was water. Groundwater seeped through every crack in the rock, and this water was hot, scalding hot. It carried the temperature of the surrounding rock, and when it dripped onto exposed skin, it raised blisters. Miners working at depth learned to wrap themselves in canvas and leather, despite the heat. just to protect themselves from the water. But you couldn't stop the water from filling the tunnels. Every mine required pumping operations that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Massive steam-powered pumps on the surface sucked water up through pipes that ran the entire depth of the shaft. If those pumps failed for even a few hours, the lower levels would flood. Men had drowned when pumps broke down. It happened more than once. Now picture yourself in one of those tunnels. You're 1,000 feet underground. The air is thick and hot and wet. Your candle gives you about 3 feet of visibility. The walls are dripping. And your job is to drill a hole into the rock face in front of you. You're holding a steel drill. It's about 3 feet long and maybe an inch in diameter with a chisel-shaped tip that's been hand-forged by the mine blacksmith. Your partner is holding a 4-pound hammer with a hickory handle worn smooth by thousands of swings. You brace the drill against the rock, point first, and hold it steady while he swings. The hammer hits the back of the drill. The impact travels through the steel and into your arms. The drill bites into the rock, maybe 1/8 of an inch. You rotate the drill slightly, a quarter turn, and hold it again. He swings again. The sound in that enclosed space is punishing, a ringing metallic crack that echoes off the walls and never quite fades before the next blow lands, over and over and over. After every few strikes, you pull the drill out, clear the rock dust from the hole with a long copper spoon, and start again. When the drill tip gets dull from hitting rock, you swap it for a sharp one and send the dull drill back to the surface to be reforged by the blacksmith. A drilling team might go through a dozen drills in a single shift. The blacksmith shop ran around the clock, sharpening and tempering steel that dulled almost as fast as it could be fixed. This process was called single jacking when one man held and struck his own drill, or double jacking when a team worked together. Double jacking was faster but required absolute trust between partners. If the hammer man missed and hit the holder's hands instead of the drill, the injury was catastrophic. Crushed fingers, shattered bones, men crippled for life by a single misplaced blow. The best drilling teams worked together for years, developing a rhythm that seemed almost telepathic. They could work in near darkness by feel alone, the holder sensing the swing coming, the striker placing his blows with mechanical precision. A good team could drill a hole about 2 inches deep in an hour. 2 inches in solid basalt, using nothing but steel and muscle and the kind of endurance most people today can barely imagine. To blast a section of rock, you needed multiple holes, usually 6 to 8, each drilled 18 to 24 inches deep. Do the math. That's a full 12-hour shift's work just to prepare for one blast. When the holes were drilled, a powder man would come through and pack them with black powder, later dynamite. The fuses were cut and lit, and everyone retreated to safe distance. The explosion shattered the rock, and then the real labor began. Because now you had tons of broken rock to clear out of the tunnel. You shoveled it into ore carts or canvas bags. You hauled it to the shaft. You loaded it into buckets or cages to be hoisted to the surface. Every piece of copper-bearing rock had to be physically moved by human muscle, and the copper itself, the native copper embedded in the rock, was heavy. Copper is dense. A chunk the size of a basketball might weigh 50 pounds. Moving any significant quantity meant backbreaking labor in tight spaces with inadequate air. The air itself was a constant problem. There was no ventilation in the modern sense. Fresh air entered through the main shaft and slowly worked its way through the tunnel system by natural circulation. But natural circulation at 1,000 feet underground means almost no movement at all. The air in the deepest drifts was stale, hot, and laden with rock dust from the drilling and blasting. Miners breathed this air for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, year after year. The rock in the Quincy wasn't quartz, so the silicosis epidemic that devastated other mining regions wasn't as severe here. But respiratory problems were endemic. Men coughed up blood. They wheezed. They aged fast. The average miner in the Quincy in the 1860s was in his 20s. By 40, if he lived that long, he was used up. Shoulders destroyed from swinging hammers. Lungs scarred from breathing dust. Hearing damaged from the constant percussion of steel on rock. And they died in the mines. They died all the time. Cave-ins claim lives every year. The rock in copper mines was harder than coal, but it still fractured. It still fell. A slab of rock dropping from a tunnel ceiling might weigh 1,000 pounds. There was no warning. One moment, a man was working. The next moment, he was buried. In September 1895, 3 miners working the 12th level of the Tamarack mine were killed instantly when a hanging wall collapsed without warning. Their bodies weren't recovered for 2 days. The rock that killed them weighed an estimated 4 tons. The men's names were John Trevithick, age 29, Michael Koivunen, age 34, and Peter Stankovich, age 22. The company records note they were experienced miners with no history of carelessness. The rock simply gave way. Falls killed men regularly. The vertical shafts required constant climbing, and the ladders were often wet, sometimes icy in winter. A man who lost his grip fell into blackness. Some shafts were hundreds of feet of open air. The Quincy mine alone documented over 40 fall fatalities between 1860 and 1900. Many of these occurred at shift change, when tired miners with numb hands climbed past fresh workers descending. A moment of lost concentration, a rung slick with groundwater, and a man tumbled past his co-workers into the void below. Blasting accidents happened despite precautions. Misfires show where a charge didn't detonate and then exploded unexpectedly when a miner returned, accounted for dozens of deaths. The powder men who handled the explosives were respected and well paid. They were also the most likely to die in an instant of miscalculation, a fuse cut too short, black powder packed too tight, a spark from a candle flame. The underground tunnels amplified blast effects. Men standing 50 feet from an explosion might survive. Men standing 20 feet away were shredded by rock fragments. And then there was fire. Underground fires in copper mines were rare compared to coal mines, but they happened. When they did, the tunnels became ovens. Smoke filled the shafts. Men suffocated trying to find their way out in darkness. In 1887, a fire in the Red Jacket shaft of the Calumet and Hecla complex killed 4 miners who couldn't reach the surface in time. The smoke rose faster than they could climb. The Calumet and Hecla Mining Company kept detailed records. Between 1869 and 1929, they documented over 500 fatalities in their mines alone. 500 men. That's 1 death every 6 weeks, on average, for 60 years. And Calumet and Hecla was considered one of the safer operations. The smaller mines, the ones run by companies cutting corners to compete, were death traps that kept no records worth trusting. Now, who were these men? Who would take this job? In the 1840s and 1850s, many of the first miners were Cornish. They came from Cornwall in southwestern England, where tin and copper mining had been a way of life for centuries. Cornwall's own mines were playing out, and thousands of skilled men faced unemployment. America offered opportunity, even if that opportunity came in the form of holes in the ground 1,000 feet deep. The Cornish brought expertise in hard rock mining that didn't exist anywhere else in America. They knew how to drill, how to blast, how to read rock for signs of instability. They understood the behavior of underground water. They could estimate the weight of a hanging slab by the sound it made when struck. They trained everyone else. The phrase "cousin Jack" became slang for a Cornish miner. When one Cornish man got hired at a mine, he'd bring his cousin, his brother, his neighbor. The letters went back to Cornwall. "There's work here. Bring the family." Entire communities transplanted themselves across the Atlantic. They built Methodist churches with whitewashed walls and singing congregations. They brought their pasty, a meat-filled pastry that became the signature lunch food of Michigan miners because it stayed warm for hours in the pocket of a jacket and could be eaten with filthy hands without contaminating the filling. You held the crimped edge and ate inward, then threw the edge away. It had absorbed the rock dust and grime from your fingers. By the 1870s and 1880s, Finnish immigrants began arriving in large numbers. Finland was poor, dominated by Russia, and offered few opportunities for men without land. America promised wages, even for dangerous work. The Finns came by the thousands. They took the jobs the Cornish men didn't want. the wettest tunnels where hot water dripped constantly, and every surface was slick. The deepest shafts, where temperatures reached levels that broke down the human body. The most dangerous contracts, the ones that paid by the footage regardless of risk. The Finns developed a reputation for toughness that bordered on recklessness. They worked hard, drank hard on their days off, and died young. They built their own communities separate from the Cornish neighborhoods. Finnish churches, Finnish newspapers, Finnish cooperative stores that competed with the company-owned operations. The Finns brought socialism with them, ideas about workers' rights, and collective action that would eventually spark some of the most bitter labor conflicts in American mining history. Other groups followed. Swedes and Norwegians who shared linguistic roots with the Finns. Croatians and Slovens from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Italians from the impoverished South. Each wave of immigrants took the lowest positions and worked their way up or died trying. The mining towns of the Quincy became ethnic patchworks where English, Finnish, Croatian, and Italian were all spoken on the same street. Each group had its own church, its own social hall, its own traditions. They lived side by side but rarely mixed outside the mines. These men lived in company towns, and you need to understand what that meant. The mining companies owned everything. The houses the workers rented, the stores where they bought food, the schools where their children learned to read, the doctor who set their broken bones, the priest who buried their dead. A miner's entire existence flowed through the company's hands. They paid wages that seemed high compared to farming back home. A miner might earn $2 a day in 1870, and which was good money for manual labor in that era, but he paid company prices for everything. Rent went to the company, deducted from his pay before he ever saw it. Food came from the company store, where prices ran 15 to 20% higher than independent shops in cities. Medical care, such as it was, came from company doctors who answered to company managers. The system wasn't slavery. Men could leave. But where would they go? They'd spent years learning skills that only applied underground. Their families were established in the community. Their children attended company schools. Their wives had social networks built around company churches. The alternative was starting over with nothing in a city that had no use for men who only knew how to swing hammers at rock. Most men stayed. They worked their shifts. They paid their rent. They drank in company saloons on their days off. They married women from their own ethnic communities. They raised children who would face the same choices they had. And when their sons turned 14, those boys went into the same mines, learning the same work, earning the same wages, breathing the same dust. If you're watching this and you understand why this history matters, then you already know this channel is for you. Subscribe and join the people who want to know how things really got built and who paid the price. Let me tell you about one specific mine, the Quincy mine. The Quincy Mining Company started operations in 1846, 2 years after the copper rush began. For the first decade, it struggled. The copper was there, but reaching it required capital the company didn't have. Several times, investors considered shutting down, but they kept going. They invested in better equipment, deeper shafts, larger steam pumps capable of lifting millions of gallons of water per day. By the 1860s, Quincy was producing significant quantities of copper. By the 1870s, it was one of the most profitable mines in the world. The secret to Quincy's success was a massive copper vein that plunged deep into the earth at a consistent angle. The company followed that vein down and down and down. By 1920, the Quincy shaft reached over 9,000 feet, nearly 2 miles below the surface. The men who worked the deep levels of the Quincy faced conditions that pushed human endurance to its limit. At 9,000 feet, the rock temperature exceeded 110 degrees. Ventilation systems pumped air down, but it arrived warm. Miners worked in shifts as short as possible, rotating constantly to prevent heat stroke. The commute to work was itself an ordeal. The company installed a massive hoist, powered first by steam and later by electricity, that lowered cages full of men into the shaft. But even at speed, descending 2 miles took time. Men spent an hour going down and another hour coming up. Their actual working time was whatever remained of their shift. The Quincy Hoist House still stands today. It contains the largest steam hoist ever built, a Nordberg hoist that could lift 10 tons at a time from depths that seemed impossible. That machine represented millions of dollars of investment and decades of engineering advancement. But every pound of copper it lifted had been loosened from the rock by human hands. Now I need to tell you about the transition. Because hand drilling didn't last forever, and the change that came transformed everything about what it meant to work underground. In the 1870s, compressed air drills, also called air drills or machine drills, began appearing in American mines. These devices used compressed air to drive a piston that hammered the drill bit into rock automatically. A single machine could drill faster than a team of men. What took 2 skilled miners an hour could be accomplished in minutes. The technology had been developed for railroad tunneling, where speed mattered more than cost. The Hoosac Tunnel in Massachusetts, completed in 1875 after nearly 20 years of construction, proved that air drills could cut through hard rock at unprecedented rates. The mining companies took notice. And Calumet and Hecla was among the first Michigan copper operations to adopt the new technology aggressively. They installed massive steam-powered compressors on the surface, built networks of pipes running down the shafts, and equipped their drilling teams with the latest machines. By the mid-1880s, machine drilling was standard in the major Keweenaw mines. The production numbers told the story. Footage that once took weeks to drill could now be completed in days. The companies sank shafts deeper, opened new levels faster, and pulled more copper out of the ground than ever before. Profits soared. But the transition wasn't smooth, and the consequences were complicated. First, the machines created new hazards. Air drills produced enormous quantities of fine rock dust, far more than hand drilling ever had. The percussion action pulverized the rock into particles fine enough to float in the air and settle deep in human lungs. Without proper water suppression, which wasn't universally adopted until later, this dust hung in the air and filled workers' respiratory systems with every breath. The same drilling that increased production also increased the rate of respiratory disease. Miners who operated air drills developed a new pattern of illness. They coughed earlier, they died younger. It would take decades before the connection between machine drilling and lung disease was fully understood, and even longer before the companies acknowledged responsibility. Second, the machines displaced workers. A single drill operator could do the work of multiple hand drilling teams. The companies still needed miners, but they needed fewer of them. Men who had spent years developing the specific skills of hand drilling found those skills obsolete almost overnight. Some transitioned to operating the new equipment. They learned to maintain the machines, to position them precisely, to keep them running through 12-hour shifts. Others were pushed into lower-paying support roles, mucking out rock after blasts, maintaining equipment, hauling supplies through the tunnels. The skilled craftsmen who had been the aristocrats of underground work became machine operators, interchangeable parts in an industrial system that valued speed over skill. Third, the machines changed the nature of the work itself. Hand drilling required skill, judgment, physical precision. It was exhausting, but it engaged the whole person. A good driller read the rock, adjusted his angle, placed his holes with attention to the natural fracture patterns in the stone. Machine drilling was still physically demanding, but the decision-making shifted elsewhere. The driller's job became positioning the machine and keeping it running. The art went out of it. The old Cornish miners resented the machines. They'd taken pride in their ability to read rock, to place holes precisely, to work faster and cleaner than anyone else. Their identity was built around those skills. Machines didn't care about craft, machines just punched holes. But the machines won. They always do. By 1900, hand drilling was a memory in the major Keweenaw mines. The men who'd built their identities around that work were retired or dead, replaced by a new generation that had never known anything else. And production soared. The copper that took an army of hand drillers years to extract now flowed out of the earth in quantities that seemed limitless. Michigan copper fed the expanding electrical grid. It built the telephone network. It wired the factories that mass-produced everything from automobiles to appliances. Between 1845 and 1887, the Keweenaw Peninsula produced over 90% of America's copper. Think about that number, 90%. Nearly every telegraph wire in the country, every electrical circuit, every motor winding. All of it came from this narrow strip of land on the shores of Lake Superior. Even after new deposits were found in Montana and Arizona, Michigan remained a major producer well into the 20th century. The Butte mines and the Arizona Copper Belt eventually surpassed the Keweenaw in total output, but for 2 generations, Michigan Copper was American Copper. The Calumet and Hecla Mining Company became one of the most valuable corporations in America. At its peak in the 1890s, it paid dividends that made its Boston investors fabulously wealthy. Men who had never seen the Keweenaw, who had never descended a ladder into darkness, who had never felt rock dust in their lungs, collected checks that represented the labor of thousands. The mines generated over $70 million in dividends during their productive years. Adjusted for inflation, that figure runs into the billions. It built mansions on Beacon Hill. It funded art collections and libraries. It endowed university chairs and charitable foundations. The copper barons lived well on the labor of men who died at 40. But none of that money stayed in Michigan. The profits flowed to investors in Boston and New York. The miners who did the work, who breathed the dust and climbed the ladders and swung the hammers, earned their wages and nothing more. $2 a day, enough to live on, never enough to get ahead. When the copper ran out, as it eventually did, the investors moved on to other ventures. The mining towns began their long decline. The strikes came periodically. Workers organized, demanded better wages, safer conditions, shorter hours. The companies resisted, sometimes violently. The most famous conflict came in 1913, when copper miners across the Keweenaw walked off the job demanding recognition of the Western Federation of Miners. The strike lasted 9 months. Families went hungry. The National Guard was called in. Private detective agencies hired by the companies, including the infamous Wattle Man Agency, patrolled the streets with clubs and guns. The strike was bitter beyond anything the region had seen. Company men and union men stopped speaking to each other. Families fractured along political lines. The Finnish newspapers supported the union. The Cornish generally sided with management, viewing the strike as an attack on the careful order that had sustained them for generations. Violence erupted sporadically. Men were beaten. Homes were burned. The strike ended in failure for the union. The companies made minor concessions but refused to recognize the union itself. Many strike leaders were blacklisted, unable to find work in any Michigan mine. Some left for the western mines, others found different trades. A few were reduced to charity. But the real tragedy came on Christmas Eve, 1913. In a place called the Italian Hall in Calumet. The union was throwing a Christmas party for miners' children. Hundreds of families packed into the second-floor hall. There was a tree decorated with candles. There were presents for every child. Music played. Despite everything, despite 9 months of suffering and uncertainty, people were trying to celebrate. Then someone yelled, "Fire!" There was no fire. Someone, possibly a company agent, possibly a drunk, possibly someone whose identity has never been established, had created a panic deliberately or accidentally. Witnesses disagree about everything except what happened next. The crowd rushed for the stairs. The stairway was narrow. Bodies piled up. People fell over each other. Children were trampled. The panic fed on itself. 73 people died, most of them children. And the bodies were laid out in the hall where the party had been held. Families searched through the dead looking for their own. The Italian Hall disaster became a rallying point for labor movements across the country. It represented everything wrong with the relationship between workers and corporations. Woody Guthrie wrote a song about it decades later. Investigations failed to identify whoever yelled fire. No one was ever held accountable. The strike was broken. The miners went back to work, and the copper kept flowing. But the Keweenaw was already in decline. The richest veins had been mined out. The remaining copper required going deeper, which cost more money. Competition from western mines, with their open pit operations and lower labor costs, undercut Michigan prices. One by one, the mines closed. Companies merged, downsized, shuttered operations. The population of the copper towns peaked around 1910 and then began a slide that would continue for a century. Now, here's where I want you to think about something. The device you're watching this on contains copper. The wires in your walls are copper. The infrastructure that delivers electricity to your home relies on copper at every stage. Every motor, every transformer, every circuit board, every charging cable, all of them contain copper. Copper conducts electricity better than any affordable metal. It's in the grid that powers your city. It's in the car you drive. It's in the data centers that store your photos. It's in the cell towers that carry your voice. Modern life runs on copper the same way it ran on copper in 1880. And every pound of that copper, somewhere in its history, connects back to work like what I've just described. Maybe not the specific mines of the Quincy, maybe copper from Arizona or Chile or Zambia or the Congo. But the pattern repeats. Men descending into the earth, men breathing dust, men lifting weight that breaks their bodies, men dying in darkness so that electricity can flow. The mines of the Quincy are mostly closed now. Quincy ran until 1945. Calumet and Hecla merged with other companies and limped along until the 1960s. A few operations continue today on a much smaller scale, processing old mine dumps or exploring new prospects, but the great era of Michigan copper ended decades ago. What remains are the headframes and hoist houses, the massive stone structures that mark where the shafts descended. Some are preserved as museums and historical sites. You can tour parts of the Quincy mine. You can descend into the upper levels and see where men worked. You can stand in tunnels carved out of rock by human hands and try to imagine what it meant to spend 12 hours there in the heat and the darkness, drilling an inch at a time into stone that seemed to resist every blow. The towns that copper built still exist: Calumet and Hancock and Houghton. They're smaller now, quieter. The grand buildings constructed during the boom years stand as monuments to wealth that flowed away. The Opera House in Calumet, built in 1900 to seat over 1,000 people, still hosts performances in a town that barely has 5,000 residents. The ornate facades of Red Jacket, the company town that served Calumet and Hecla, line streets that rarely see crowds anymore. The populations are a fraction of what they were when 20,000 men worked underground. The young people leave for cities with more opportunity. The old people remember stories their grandfathers told about working the mines. The connection to that history fades a little more with every passing year. But the copper they pulled from the earth is still here. It's in the wires above your head. It's in the motors that run your refrigerator. It's in the charging cable for your phone. Every electron that powers your life flows through copper that someone somewhere brought up from the dark. Subscribe if you want to see more stories like this one. Stories about the work that built America and the workers who've been forgotten. I'll see you in the next one. The men who drilled copper out of Michigan's rock by hand are all gone now. The last of them died generations ago. Their names survive in company records, in census documents, in occasional photographs where bearded men in dirty clothes stare back at cameras with expressions that seem to challenge you to understand what they endured. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as men doing jobs. Hard jobs, dangerous jobs, but jobs that needed doing. They'd have been suspicious of anyone who tried to romanticize their suffering. They lived it. They didn't need to dress it up, but we owe them something. Not sympathy exactly, something closer to acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that the electricity we take for granted came from somewhere, that before the switches and the sockets and the power plants, there were men in darkness, swinging hammers, breathing dust. I'm counting the hours until they could climb back into the sunlight. The lights in your house work because of them. The phone in your pocket works because of them. Every convenience of modern life traces back through wires and cables and circuits to the places where copper was pulled from the ground, 1,000 feet below the surface, 12 hours a day, an inch at a time. That's how the grid was built.